Today we begin a series about how World War II is presented in history textbooks from different countries. Later episodes will cover the United States, France, and the United Kingdom. For now, we're starting with Japan. One of the biggest misconceptions many people have is that Japan surrendered immediately after the 2 atomic bombs were dropped. That's not exactly true. After the first bomb was used, American forces also began dropping leaflets over Japan, in Japanese, urging people to accept an honourable surrender and live in peace. But that didn't faze Japan's leadership at all. They were prepared to fight on to the last samurai. There are a few reasons for that. First, the bombing of Hiroshima had not even been formally discussed at a meeting of Japan's Supreme War Council. Second, the pro-war faction continued preparing women, the elderly and children to fight the invaders, even with improvised weapons, including bamboo spears. And third, partisan bases were being established in the mountains to carry out guerrilla warfare. In short, many in Japan were ready to resist an invasion with everything they had. So what finally forced Japan to surrender? On August 9, 1945, the Soviet Union, breaking its neutrality pact, suddenly invaded Manchuria. That was the moment when Japan truly began to accept defeat. Japanese historian and Professor Tsuyoshi Hasegawa argues the same point in his book Racing the Enemy. As he writes, "One day after the atomic bomb was dropped, neither the cabinet nor any member of the Peace Party believed that any change of policy was needed. In other words, neither factor alone, the atomic bombs or the Soviet invasion, fully explained surrender. Taken together, they pushed Japan to the point of capitulation. That's the big picture." In this episode, we'll also look at how these events are described in Japanese school books. But before we dive in, it's important to understand how Japan's education system handles history. Japan doesn't have a single, official textbook that every student uses. Instead, there are several approved history textbooks, and teachers can choose which one to base their lessons on. Here are images of the 4 main Japanese history textbooks used in schools. Japanese history textbooks generally treat the European theatre and the Asia-Pacific theatre separately, but connect them under the broader umbrella of World War II. Naturally, the emphasis in Japanese books is on events that took place in Asia and the Pacific, since those events are most relevant to Japan. When it comes to sensitive topics, for example, Japan's colonial policies in the 20th century, the brutal Unit 731, and the mistreatment of Chinese and Korean civilians, textbooks often either gloss over the subject or present only minimal softened facts. That's somewhat understandable. Japan committed very harsh acts in the region, and these subjects remain deeply painful and controversial. The textbooks tend to tone things down rather than go into graphic detail. Now let's move chronologically. Japanese textbooks usually mark 2 starting points for the war. The first is the formal beginning in Europe, when Hitler invaded Poland on September 1, 1939. The second, and more relevant for Asia, is the escalation of hostilities between Japan and China into full-scale war in 1937. Textbooks often reference the background to these conflicts. For instance, the earlier Japan-China clashes in the 1930s, including the skirmish near the Marco Polo Bridge in 1937. Even so, conflicts with China are described in a restrained manner. Yes, the textbooks acknowledge Japan's aggressive actions in Asia. The invasion of Manchuria in 1931 is mentioned. But many books shift the emphasis onto external circumstances. The narrative tends to frame Japanese actions as responses to pressure. We didn't want this, but we had no choice. We were defending ourselves against Western colonial empires. That narrative overlooks some inconvenient facts. By 1937, Japan had already taken a large part of China and installed the puppet state of Manchukuo. So the clash at the Marco Polo Bridge hardly came out of nowhere. The details are messy. Japanese troops were conducting exercises near Beijing, around the Marco Polo Bridge, when a Japanese soldier suddenly went missing. Shots were fired. Each side blamed the other. Curiously, the missing soldier reappeared a few hours later, but the skirmish had already escalated. Then came the infamous Nanking Massacre in December 1937. Japanese troops entered Nanking, the then capital of the Chinese nationalist government, and for about 6 weeks carried out widespread violence, killings, and atrocities. Japanese textbooks call this episode tragic and admit that soldiers killed civilians and prisoners. They acknowledge the shame of those acts, but they often avoid specifics about the numbers. Estimates of the dead vary widely. Many historians put the toll between 150,000 and 200,000. After those events, Hitler's invasion of Poland on September 1st, 1939, marks Europe's entry into war. Japanese textbooks usually note that date as the formal start of the global conflict, but they don't go into much detail about it. Instead, they describe Japan's alignment with Germany and Italy, the Tripartite Pact, which formed the Axis powers of Berlin, Rome and Tokyo. Textbooks emphasize that while Japan was allied with Germany and Italy, the countries had different strategic goals. Japan was focused on its own regional ambitions in Asia, while cooperation with Germany was mostly limited to technology and intelligence exchanges. Italy is often portrayed as strategically unimportant to Japan. Only on December 7th, 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor, does Japan truly enter the broader global stage of World War II. Events before Pearl Harbor are often treated as a separate regional conflict. But what interests historians and students is how Japanese textbooks explain why Japan moved from regional aggression to full participation in the World War. Most textbooks list four main causes. First, the rise of nationalism in several countries. Second, imperial competition for colonies and resources among the major powers. Third, the tensions and rivalries among the United States, Japan, Germany, the Soviet Union, Britain, and France. And fourth, economic sanctions against Japan. Put simply, every global power was jockeying for resources and influence. Japan argues in these texts it had to do the same. Facing crippling sanctions and limits meant to prevent Japanese expansion, Tokyo felt boxed in, and expansion in East Asia became, in their telling, a necessary response. Japanese strategists also argued that US and British interests in the region made confrontation inevitable. Therefore, they reasoned it was better to strike first than to be struck later. That logic led directly to Pearl Harbor. So, how exactly is Pearl Harbor described in Japanese textbooks? In some of them, the attack on the US naval base is explained as a strategic move by Japan, a necessary preemptive strike meant to secure an advantage in the Pacific. Fair enough. But why attack the United States specifically? Here, Japanese history books typically list three main reasons. First, economic sanctions and the threat of a resource crisis. The United States and its allies imposed an embargo on oil and froze Japan's assets, which crippled both its military and civilian industries. From Japan's perspective, this was an attempt to strangle its economy, leaving war as the only remaining path. Second, the expansion of Japan's sphere of influence, and what they describe as an act of self-defense. Japanese leaders were convinced the US would eventually attack them anyway, because Japan was asserting control over territories in Southeast Asia, a region full of American interests. So, they reasoned, better to strike first. And third, the belief in a quick and decisive victory. As with many wars in history, leaders assumed that the conflict would be over swiftly. Textbooks note that the plan was to deliver a lightning strike on America's main naval base, crush its morale, and buy time for further conquests across Asia. To Japan's credit, its modern textbooks do not entirely excuse the attack. They explicitly acknowledge that it was an act of aggression, admitting responsibility and guilt. The tone is reflective rather than defensive, though it still emphasizes that Japan felt cornered by economic isolation. The overall message can be summed up like this: we did wrong, and we take responsibility, but we were pushed into a situation with no other choice. The next section deals with Japan's expansion across Southeast Asia. According to one textbook, Japan's seizure of colonies was seen as a natural extension of its military campaign following Pearl Harbor. The main timeline goes like this: December 8th, 1941. Simultaneously with the Pearl Harbor attack, Japan invaded British Malaya and Singapore. December 1941. Spring 1942. Japanese forces attacked the Philippines, where American troops eventually surrendered a few months later. January 1942. Japan began invading the Dutch East Indies, today's Indonesia, and by March had captured most of the territory, including Java and Sumatra. As for why these conquests were necessary, Japanese textbooks often frame it under the slogan, Asia for Asians. In other words, Japan's aim was to remove Western colonial powers, the US, Britain and the Netherlands, from the region. The subtext was simple: Asia should be ruled by Asians, not foreigners. Of course, the resources in these liberated areas conveniently flowed to Japan. but the official message was wrapped in anti-colonial rhetoric, the idea of freeing Asia from Western domination. Next comes the Battle of Midway, fought from June 4th to 7th, 1942. Japanese school programs describe it as the decisive turning point in the Pacific. Japan's navy lost 4 aircraft carriers and many of its most experienced pilots. From that point on, the strategic initiative shifted to the United States. Japan's textbooks attribute the defeat to several factors: America's technological superiority, greater access to resources, and Japan's overstretched forces fighting on multiple fronts. Interestingly, in some middle school editions, there isn't even a dedicated section on Midway or Guadalcanal. The battles are mentioned briefly, almost in passing. Then we reach Okinawa, one of the most important and tragic chapters in Japanese war education. At that time, Okinawa was a crucial strategic island, essentially Japan's final defensive line. Military leaders believed that if Okinawa fell, the US could invade the main islands next. So the order was simple: defend it at all costs. Many textbooks feature a chapter literally titled, "Okinawa Becomes a Battlefield." It emphasizes not only the clash between regular armies, but also the devastating involvement of civilians. Textbooks describe massive civilian casualties, forced evacuations, and even group suicides, sometimes carried out under military pressure. In Japanese education, Okinawa has become a symbol of the horrors of war, of what happens when fighting reaches your homeland. The message is consistently pacifist. Even the most desperate defense cannot protect people from unbearable suffering and destruction. At the end of these chapters, authors often guide students toward a moral reflection. Japan must never allow such a tragedy to happen again. It's worth remembering the historical moment. By spring 1945, Berlin had already fallen. Japan was the last Axis nation still fighting the Allies. Next, textbooks briefly mention the Eastern and Western fronts, that is, Europe's side of the war. Since Japan wasn't directly involved there, these events are covered very concisely. They describe Germany's campaign against the Soviet Union, highlighting Stalingrad and Kursk as the turning points in the East. The Western Front, from the invasion of Poland and France to the Battle of Britain and the Normandy landings, is summarized in a few lines. Essentially, all major events are included, but they serve as background context. The spotlight remains on Asia and the Pacific, as you'd expect. Hitler is portrayed plainly as a dictator responsible for unleashing the war in Europe and for the genocide of Jews and other peoples. His policies are described as leading to some of the greatest tragedies of the 20th century. Still, if you ask the Chinese or Koreans who they consider the greatest villain of that century, many would probably place Hitler second. So how do Japanese textbooks justify their alliance with him? Surprisingly simply. They describe the partnership as formal rather than ideological, not a bond of shared values, but a strategic arrangement. Japan needed to project strength and deter the United States and Britain from attacking. Having a powerful ally like Hitler, they reasoned, might make those countries think twice. Finally, the books mention the Soviet Union's entry into the war, when, in August 1945, Stalin declared war on Japan, violating the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact that was supposed to last until 1946. Now we come to the final, and perhaps the most emotional part: Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and the end of the war, and how all of this is presented in Japanese history textbooks. According to those textbooks, Japan's surrender resulted from 2 interconnected factors. First, the atomic bombings, and second, the Soviet Union's entry into the war. The tragedy of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is always the centerpiece of the final chapters. These sections are often accompanied by appeals for peace and nuclear disarmament. Students read that in Hiroshima, between 70,000 and 80,000 people were killed instantly, or within the first few days, and in Nagasaki around 40,000 were killed or went missing. By the end of 1945, the total death toll had reached roughly 200,000 to 220,000, not counting those who later died from radiation exposure. Most textbooks emphasize that the bombings had a massive psychological and military impact, accelerating Japan's decision to surrender. But interestingly, there is no tone of accusation toward the United States. Instead, the narrative focuses on a moral lesson. We must do everything in our power to ensure this never happens again, not just in Japan, but anywhere in the world. At the same time, some modern editions also mention that the Soviet defeat of Japan's Kwantung Army in Manchuria was another decisive factor leading to surrender. Others omit the Soviet role entirely. Finally, on August 14, 1945, after the bombings and the Soviet invasion, Emperor Hirohito made his decision. Calmly and resolutely, he announced Japan's unconditional surrender. What conclusions can we draw from how this is taught? One fascinating feature of Japan's school curriculum is the focus on ordinary life during wartime. Many textbooks include entire sections describing how people lived, how children studied, what food they ate, how evacuations were organized, and how each city suffered during the conflict. Personally, I find this approach remarkable. On one hand, it's engaging. It lets students imagine what life would have been like, what they might have eaten, worn, or talked about if they had lived in that era. But on the other hand, it serves a deeper purpose. By walking students through these everyday experiences, the curriculum gently leads them to the realization that peace and cooperation are far better than any war. That pacifist message runs throughout Japan's modern education. As a nation that endured 2 atomic bombings, Japan has embraced a clear anti-war identity, a conviction that such suffering must never be repeated. Another characteristic of Japanese education is its strong focus on national history, especially the ancient and classical periods. In fact, much more classroom time is devoted to early Japanese civilization than to World War II, and that may be for the best. Yes, textbooks mention Japan's wartime crimes, but they do so briefly and cautiously, often highlighting external pressures or political circumstances that forced Japan's hand. In contrast, Chinese and Korean textbooks describe those same atrocities, the Nanking Massacre, human experiments, forced labour, in vivid and painful detail, ensuring that those nations never forget what Japan did. That's why many modern Japanese people genuinely don't understand why there's still so much resentment from China and Korea. They ask, what did we do that was so terrible, unaware of how differently the same history is told just across the sea. Japanese textbooks also try to connect the past with the present. They draw parallels between wartime history and modern issues like globalization, diplomacy, and peacekeeping, helping students see that history's lessons still apply today. We also compared older post-war textbooks with the modern ones. The difference is striking. The early editions, written right after World War II, were dry and factual, just dates, numbers, and events, with little interpretation. Modern textbooks, however, encourage students to think critically, to ask why things happened, how countries interacted, and what could have been done differently. And that's a great step forward. In general, Japan's school program today strikes a delicate balance between national pride and historical self-reflection. It promotes pacifism, cultural continuity, and international cooperation. Japan stands as a remarkable example of a nation with a dark and violent past, and I should stress, a past as horrifying as what Hitler unleashed in Europe, that nevertheless managed to confront its mistakes, learn from them, and move toward peace. It's tragic that those lessons had to be learned through such immense bloodshed, suffering, and the horrors of nuclear destruction, but they were learned. So, as always, let's value peace, friends. Subscribe if you'd like to hear more about how history is taught from different national perspectives. This video was created by real people. Every fact was verified, and all images used are authentic historical photographs, not AI generated. We still can't afford a human voice actor, so this episode is narrated using text-to-speech. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next one.